The rain had been falling for 3 hours before Dorothy Hayward finally allowed herself to pull off the highway. Not because she was tired. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 months, and one more hour behind the wheel wasn't going to break her. Not because she was lost. She knew exactly where she was, mile marker 112, on Highway 50, 46 miles east of Fallon, Nevada, in the kind of darkness that swallowed everything whole and gave nothing back. And not because she had run out of courage, though courage was something she had to keep reminding herself she still possessed. Like a word in a language you once spoke fluently, that you haven't needed in a long time and now have to search for before it comes. She pulled off because the wipers on Wendell's old Buick couldn't keep up with the rain anymore. And driving blind on a desert highway at 11:30 at night was the one risk she couldn't afford to take. Not tonight. Not when every quiet sacrifice, every sleepless calculation, every morning she had forced herself out of bed, when all she wanted was to pull the covers over her head and disappear into the dark, had been leading to this. The sign for the Desert Star Diner appeared through the blur of rain and wet glass like something conjured from a wish. Pink neon, a five-pointed star with one arm slightly dimmer than the others. A gravel lot with a handful of vehicles scattered under a single overhead light that swayed in the wind and made the shadows move in restless, inconsistent directions. Dorothy looked at the sign for a moment. Then she looked at the rearview mirror. The road behind her was dark and empty, and rain-slicked. But she knew with the precise, exhausted certainty of someone who had been calculating this for weeks that empty was not the same as unobserved. She turned into the lot. She did not choose this diner by accident. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, because honesty was one of the few things she had left, and she had no intention of compromising it even in the private conversations she was having inside her own head. She had chosen this diner because it was 46 miles from the last place anyone had tracked her stopping, because it sat on a stretch of Highway 50 that was a known regular route for certain motorcycle clubs traveling between Barstow and Reno, and because it was the kind of stop that didn't have cameras in the parking lot. She had also chosen it because Wendell had told her on a road trip they had taken through Nevada 7 years ago that diners like this one were where real people went when they needed something real. He had said it with the simple conviction he brought to most things he believed. And she had filed it away the way she filed everything. Wendell said, not always understanding it immediately, but trusting that the understanding would come when she needed it. She also knew and had known for 11 days that the car she was driving had a GPS tracker mounted inside the rear wheel well, a small magnetic unit professionally installed, the kind that updated its position every 30 seconds to a monitoring account she had no access to. Roy Etten had found it when he swept the Buick 3 weeks into his undercover work, and he had called her with the information on a prepaid phone and given her a choice: remove it or use it. Dorothy had thought about it for exactly one day. Then she had called Roy back and told him to leave it exactly where it was. If Victor Crane knew where she was going, she needed him to come to her on ground she had chosen. A diner on a highway where certain men stopped regularly. A room with witnesses. A place with walls and a door and enough ambient light to see everything that walked in. She had chosen the diner. She had chosen the night. She had chosen the ground. What she hadn't chosen, what she had only hoped for with the fumbling, half-abandoned kind of hope that grief sometimes returns a person to, was who would be sitting in it when she arrived. Dorothy Hayward sat in the parking lot for exactly 90 seconds. She counted them. It was something she had started doing in the weeks after Wendell's funeral. Counting seconds, counting steps, counting the number of times she had picked up the phone and then set it back down, because there was no one left who would understand what she was about to tell them. Counting had become a way of staying inside her own body when everything inside her wanted to fly apart. 90 seconds. Then she opened the door. The rain hit her immediately. Hard cold, the kind of Nevada desert rain that comes down sideways and has no patience for anyone foolish enough to be standing in it. Her wool coat soaked through in the time it took to cross the parking lot. And by the time she reached the diner door, her white hair was plastered flat against her head, and water was running in cold lines down the back of her neck. She was 74 years old. She was 5 feet tall on a good day, and she had never in her life felt quite so small as she did standing in front of that door, her hand on the handle, the rain hammering the metal roof above her like it was trying to drive her back. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The warmth hit her first. Then the smell burnt coffee frying bacon, the particular combination of grease and fluorescent light that belongs only to diners in the American desert at midnight. A country song played low from a speaker somewhere above the counter. Something mournful and half familiar. The kind of song that sounds like it's been playing in rooms like this one since before anyone now living can remember. The linoleum floor was the color of old mustard. Dorothy stood in the entrance and let the door close behind her, and did what she had trained herself to do over the past several weeks. She looked at every person in the room, carefully, in order. A truck driver at the counter, large man, maybe 55, face tilted toward a plate of eggs with the fixed expression of someone who had stopped tasting his food years ago. He hadn't looked up when she walked in. Two young people in a booth by the window. College age probably. A boy and a girl, their heads close together over a shared phone screen, whispering something private and urgent that had nothing to do with anything outside their small orbit. A woman behind the counter, the waitress. 50s heavy-set, moving a dish towel in slow circles over the same section of counter she had probably wiped 100 times tonight. Her name tag said Norma. She was already looking at Dorothy with the automatic customer service attention of someone who had worked too many late shifts to be surprised by anything that walked through the door. And then in the far corner booth with his back against the wall and a coffee mug sitting untouched in front of him, the man Dorothy had been hoping to find. She had not known he would be here. She had hoped in the way that people who have done everything they can think of and have come to the end of their own resources sometimes allow themselves to hope for something they cannot control. She had prayed, if she was being completely honest, in the fumbling and half-abandoned way that grief sometimes returns a person to prayer. She had prayed that when she walked through the door of whatever place she stopped tonight, there would be someone inside who looked like they couldn't be bought. The man in the corner booth looked like he couldn't be bought. He was enormous. Not just tall enormous in the way that certain men are enormous, a physical presence that announced itself before you had even fully processed the individual details. 6'3" at minimum, with the kind of shoulders that suggested a lifetime of hard use rather than deliberate cultivation. A full beard, dark shot through with threads of gray, covering a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete some years ago and had not shown any inclination to soften since. His hands wrapped around the coffee mug, with the grip of someone who was used to holding things that required some effort to hold. The leather vest he wore over a dark thermal shirt was covered in patches, embroidered insignia place markers, the worn heraldry of a life lived on American highways, and the largest of them, red iron reapers across the shoulders, in letters stitched there with the seriousness of a military insignia. Everyone else in the diner had arranged themselves to be as far from that corner booth as possible. Dorothy Hayward walked straight toward it. She was aware of how she looked, soaked through, trembling not entirely from the cold, though the cold was real enough. Her eyes wouldn't stop moving to the windows to the parking lot outside where the rain was making mirrors of the puddles and the overhead light kept catching in ways that looked briefly like approaching headlights. She was aware that she looked exactly like what she was on the outside, a frightened old woman who had nowhere else to go. That was fine. She had decided somewhere around mile marker 80 that looking frightened was not the same thing as being defeated. The fear she felt was real, physical, specific, the kind that sits in the chest like a stone and doesn't shift when you breathe around it. But she had been carrying it for 3 months, and she had learned that you could carry a stone in your chest and still walk forward. Wendell had taught her that in the last months of his life without ever putting it into those words. He had taught it by example the way he taught most things. She reached the corner booth. She gripped the edge of the table with both hands because her legs needed the steadiness. The man looked up at her slowly, the way people look up when they have already registered your approach, but are giving you time to announce your purpose before they form an opinion about it. Up close, his eyes were dark and steady, not unkind. That was the thing she noticed first, and it was the thing that made her breath catch briefly in her chest, because she had not expected that. She had prepared herself for indifference at best, hostility at worst. She had prepared herself for a wall. His eyes were not unkind. She leaned down close enough that only he could hear her over the rain and the low music and the refrigerator hum, and she said the only 6 words she had that could open this particular door. "Please pretend you're my grandson." He blinked. Once. Then, with a voice that came out of him like something climbing up from the bottom of a very deep place, he said quietly, "What?" And before she could answer, before she could say another word, the headlights swept across the front windows. Dorothy's body went rigid. She knew those headlights. She had seen them twice in her rearview mirror over the past 2 hours, always at the same distance, always moving at the same speed as the Buick. She had told herself both times that she was imagining it. She had known both times that she was not. And now they were here in this parking lot exactly as she had known they would be, because she had driven here with the tracker on the car, and the tracker had told them exactly where she was going, and they had come. On her terms, on her chosen ground. The black SUV rolled into the parking lot, with its engine still running, sitting under the yellow glow of the overhead light, like a patient animal waiting for instruction. Dorothy's hand found the man's arm. She gripped it. "He's here," she whispered. "Please, just please." Cole Maddox had spent the better part of his adult life developing a skill that had no official name and could not be listed on any resume. The skill was this: he could read the difference between fear that people performed and fear that actually lived inside them. He had seen both varieties. He had been the cause of both at various points in his life, and he was not proud of that, but he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge it without flinching. The woman gripping his arm was not performing anything. Whatever was looking out of her eyes at the black SUV in the parking lot, that was the real thing, old and deep and specific. The kind of fear that has a name and a face and a history attached to it. Not the shapeless fear of someone startled in a dark alley. The precise, exhausted fear of someone who has been running from something they know very well for a very long time and has run until the running is almost finished. Cole set down his coffee mug. He registered several things quickly, the way he had trained himself to register things after years of needing to make decisions faster than most people could form an opinion. The first thing was that the SUV had been sitting in the lot before the woman came in. He had noted it when he parked his bike 40 minutes ago, its position, its Nevada plates. The fact that its engine was still running, but no one had gotten out. He had filed it and moved on. Now he opened that file again. The SUV had been there first, which meant it hadn't followed her here from the road, which meant someone had known she was coming to this specific diner before she arrived. And that changed the shape of the situation considerably. It meant this wasn't an improvised pursuit. It was something more deliberate, something with advanced knowledge and preparation behind it. Cole looked at the woman's face for one more second. Then he slid across the booth to make room. "Grandma," he said, and his voice came out at a register he rarely used. Not loud exactly, but carrying the kind of voice that fills a room without effort. The voice of a man accustomed to being heard over engine noise and highway wind, and the collective sound of men who are not inclined to be quiet. "I told you not to wander off in this weather." The woman didn't hesitate. She sat down beside him and wrapped both her thin arms around one of his, like she had been doing it for decades. She was shaking so hard he could feel it through his sleeve. "Sorry, sweetheart," she said softly. Her voice was steadier than her hands. Across the diner, Norma the waitress had frozen in mid-wipe. The truck driver had lifted his head from his eggs. The two college kids had looked up from their phone, and at the front of the diner, standing just inside the door with rain darkening the shoulders of his suit jacket, a tall man had stopped walking. Victor Crane was 45 years old and had the kind of face that communicated competence the way some faces communicate warmth, as a fundamental quality of the features, rather than as an expression layered over them. Sharp-nosed thin metal glasses that caught the fluorescent light in small, clean rectangles. When he moved, hair combed with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was a form of argument and had been making that argument successfully for a long time. He wore his suit the way certain men wore suits, not as clothing, but as a statement. The statement said, "I have authority in rooms you haven't been invited into. I know how things work. You should probably not waste either of our time." He had stopped walking because the booth at the back of the diner contained something he had not anticipated. And Victor Crane was a man who did not like to encounter things he had not anticipated. He stood there for a moment, and Cole watched him from across the diner, with the patient attention he gave to all things worth watching, while the recalculation happened behind those thin-rimmed glasses. The recalculation was thorough and fast, and it produced a conclusion that Crane apparently decided was manageable because, after a moment, he adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. A small, precise gesture that Cole would come to recognize as the physical tell of a man buying himself a half-second to reconstruct his composure, and walked forward. He stopped beside the table. He offered a smile that traveled exactly as far as the corners of his mouth, and no further. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. His voice belonged to boardrooms and deposition halls, controlled and professionally warm. "But I believe there's been some confusion." He looked at the woman beside Cole with an expression calibrated so carefully toward the patient concern that it must have required practice. "Mom, I've been looking for you." The woman sitting against Cole's arm went rigid. Not visibly, she didn't move, didn't make a sound. But Cole felt the change in her body the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. A tightening, something closing against something else. Cole looked at Crane without expression. "Doesn't look confused to me." Crane's smile remained exactly where he had placed it. "She has episodes," he said, the gentleness in his voice technically impeccable. "The doctors call it sundowning. It's most common in the evening hours. She tends to wander when she's distressed." He reached into his jacket pocket, and Cole's hand moved slightly on the table, old instinct reading the motion and calculating it before his conscious mind had caught up. But Crane only produced a phone and turned the screen toward Cole. "A photo, so you can see." The screen showed the woman in the booth beside Cole, standing next to Crane in front of a large house. She was wearing a clean dress and a pearl necklace, her white hair neatly arranged, smiling with what appeared to be warmth. The house behind them was the kind of house that came with a name. The image was well composed, well lit, the kind of photograph that suggests both prosperity and family. Cole looked at it with the even attention he gave to things he was in the process of deciding about. Then he noticed something. The pearl necklace in the photograph hung slightly to the left of center on the woman's collar, resting against her left shoulder. The way a necklace shifts when a person tilts their head in a certain direction or when a clasp is positioned slightly off-center. Cole looked at the woman sitting beside him. Her pearl necklace rested to the right of center, against her right shoulder, in exactly the same manner, the same tilt, the same drift, the same characteristic position that the necklace acquires when it has been worn in the same way by the same person for a long time. Left in the photograph, right in reality. The image had been flipped horizontally. Not the whole image, the house behind them looked right. The shadows fell at natural angles. Only the central figures had been mirrored. It was the kind of modification that digital editing could perform in seconds, and that most people would never notice, because most people didn't look at pearl necklaces in photographs with the particular quality of attention that Cole had developed over years of noticing the thing that didn't fit. He looked at the photo for a moment longer, as though he was still considering it. Then he looked at the woman beside him. "My grandma says she doesn't know you," Cole said. Crane's polite expression tightened. "Not much, enough. I understand you're trying to be helpful," he said. "But this is a family matter. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me handle it." "She's sitting right here," Cole said. "You can ask her yourself." A pause. Crane's gaze moved to the woman for a moment, and something passed between them. A look with history in it, compressed and fast, the kind of look that has years of context loaded into a single second. Then Crane returned his attention to Cole. "Sir," he said, dropping his voice slightly, the way a person drops their voice when they want the conversation to feel more private without actually being private. "I don't think you understand what's at stake here. Let the woman come with me and you can get back to your evening." The rain hammered the windows. The country song on the diner speaker had ended and nothing had replaced it. Norma, behind the counter, stood perfectly still, her dish towel hanging from one hand, watching with the wide-eyed, careful attention of someone who has realized that something is happening that is larger than the room it's happening in. Cole looked at the woman beside him. She was looking back at him. Her eyes were very dark, very steady, and full of something that wasn't quite a message and wasn't quite a plea. It was more like an accounting, an honest presentation of everything she was and everything she was asking him to believe, compressed into a single moment of eye contact. He held the look for 2 seconds. Then he stood up. The booth creaked. He unfolded to his full height, and the change it produced in the immediate environment was immediate and wordless. Crane, who had clearly spent the past several years being the most physically imposing person in most rooms he entered, had to adjust his chin upward by a perceptible margin. The two men Cole had clocked near the entrance. They had come in 30 seconds after Crane and positioned themselves with the specific casualness of men who have been told to be casual and have not been given enough time to practice it. Both shifted their weight. "She doesn't want to go," Cole said. Crane held his ground. His jaw had tightened, but his voice remained controlled. "You have no idea who you're interfering with." Cole looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has stood in front of many difficult people and has learned that patience is a more effective response than most of its alternatives. "Probably not," he said. For a moment neither of them spoke. The rain came down outside. The overhead light above the counter flickered once, twice, and then steadied. Then the voice came from the booth. It wasn't loud. Dorothy Hayward did not raise her voice. What she did was speak with a clarity and a steadiness that cut through the ambient noise of the diner. The rain, the refrigerator hum, the low electric buzz of the overhead lights, and arrived in every corner of that small fluorescent room, without effort or apparent strain. "This man is not my son." Crane went very still, "and my husband did not die in an accident." The two young people by the window had stopped breathing. The truck driver at the counter had turned on his stool and was looking at the back of the room with the alert, still expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know when something real is happening. Norma had set her dish towel down on the counter without looking at it. Crane's composed expression did something complicated. The machinery of it all, that carefully maintained patience and polished authority, didn't collapse exactly. It bent, the way expensive things bend when you push them past what they were built to handle. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice had dropped to a register that was technically still controlled, but was carrying something under it that wasn't. "Don't do this here." Cole had remained standing through all of this, very still, watching. Now he felt something he hadn't expected to feel when he'd walked into this diner an hour ago, wanting coffee and 10 quiet minutes before getting back on the road to Reno. He had come in wanting to be alone in the particular way that grief makes people want to be alone, not because they don't want company, but because they're not sure they can be good company, and they'd rather be honestly solitary than falsely present. He had a friend waiting in a funeral home in Reno, A brother in the way that word worked among men who had ridden together for the better part of 2 decades. He had been thinking about that and about the particular specific weight of loss, and he had not been thinking about anything else. He had not come in wanting any part of whatever this was. But the woman in the booth had spoken those 2 sentences into the room without flinching, and the man in the grey suit had responded to them with controlled, quiet fury. And somewhere in the 30 years of human judgment that Cole Maddox had accumulated, like sediment over the floor of his experience, something had resolved into certainty. She was telling the truth. He didn't know what truth exactly. He didn't have the context. He didn't know who her husband had been, or what had happened to him, or what it had to do with the man in the expensive suit who was standing 3 feet away, radiating the particular menace of someone who is very accustomed to getting what he came for. He didn't know any of it, but she was telling the truth, and she was 74 years old and soaking wet and trembling. And the black SUV that had been waiting in the parking lot before she arrived was still out there, with its engine running. And Cole had seen enough situations in his life to know the difference between a complication and a wrong. He settled back into the booth beside Dorothy, not all the way seated, perched at the edge, feet on the floor, weight not quite committed to sitting, but not standing either. A position that communicated he was not going anywhere. Say what you need to say, he told Dorothy quietly. I'm here. Crane stepped closer to the table. His voice had gone flat and very professional, the pretense of family concern abandoned now. This is your last opportunity, Pertal, he said, addressed to Cole rather than Dorothy. Step away from this. Whatever she's told you, whatever she's promised you, it isn't worth what comes next. Cole picked up his coffee mug and took a slow sip. The message was simple. He wasn't going anywhere. Crane looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Dorothy. Then he took his phone out of his pocket and typed something with 2 thumbs, quick and precise, the efficiency of a man who does this regularly, and put it back. 30 seconds later, the diner door opened. 2 men stepped inside. They were large, dark-jacketed, and moved with the deliberate economy of men who do physical work for other men and require no additional instructions once they have been told where to position themselves. They took up places near the entrance without looking at anything in particular, which was its own way of looking at everything. The college kids exchanged a look. The truck driver slid off his stool, left folded bills on the counter without counting them, and walked toward the door. One of the dark-jacketed men stepped slightly aside to let him through. The truck driver left without looking back. Norma stood behind the counter with both hands flat on the surface and her face arranged into the professional neutrality of a woman who has been told without a single word being spoken that the smart move is to stay still and stay quiet. Crane pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat down across from the booth. He crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands in his lap with the practiced patience of a man who has learned that the transition from pressure to waiting is sometimes the most effective move available. Let's talk about this reasonably, he said. Cole said nothing. Dorothy said nothing. Crane looked at Dorothy directly. You know what you have, he said, and you know it doesn't belong to you. Whatever Wendell told you, whatever he gave you, it's part of something you don't fully understand, and taking it to anyone outside this room is going to make things considerably worse for everyone involved, including you. Something happened in Dorothy's face when he said Wendell's name. It was small and it was over quickly, but Cole caught it, a brief tightening around the eyes, not grief exactly. Something older and harder than grief. The look of someone who has finished grieving and is now operating on something else entirely. She reached into the inside pocket of her soaked wool coat. Her hand came out holding a white envelope crumpled at the corners, slightly damp from the rain. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on the table in front of Cole and took her hand away. The room was very quiet. Cole looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up. Then he looked at Dorothy. If I don't leave this diner tonight, she said. and her voice had the quality of something that has been rehearsed, not in front of a mirror, but in the small hours of many sleepless nights. I need you to send that. Cole picked up the envelope, turned it over. On the front, written in careful block letters in blue pen, was an address. Cole read it once, read it again. FBI Field Office, Las Vegas, Nevada. The room was very quiet. Cole looked up at Victor Crane. Crane was looking at the envelope with an expression Cole was learning to read. The composed, patient surface of his face had developed a fracture in it, small and deep, visible only to someone who had been watching for it. The fracture said something that Crane's voice hadn't said and wouldn't say. The envelope was what he had come here for, not Dorothy herself. Dorothy was incidental, a necessary step in retrieving what mattered. The envelope was the point, and she had just placed it in the hands of a man Crane had no file on, no leverage over, no entry point into. "Let me explain something," Crane said. And now his voice had a new quality, quieter, more precise, the temperature drop that precedes a particular kind of storm. He uncrossed his legs and leaned slightly forward. "That envelope doesn't have what you think it has. And even if it did, the people you'd be sending it to already have arrangements with the people you think it would hurt. This is a system. Systems don't break from the outside with a wet envelope and a stranger's good intentions." Dorothy looked at him. "Wendell thought the same thing," she said, "right up until he didn't." The rain came down. The neon sign outside painted everything pink and dim and smeared. Somewhere beneath the sound of the rain, somewhere down the long dark throat of Highway 50, stretching north toward Reno, a sound had begun that was not rain and not wind and not the idling of the black SUV in the parking lot. It was low, it was rhythmic. It was the kind of sound that Cole Maddox had spent the better part of his adult life generating and living inside of. And he recognized it the way you recognize your own name spoken across a crowded room. Engines, big ones, coming from the south, moving north. A sound that was currently as small as a rumor, and would within the next several minutes become something considerably more than that. Cole felt something shift in the interior geography of the night. He didn't let it show. He set his coffee mug down and looked at Crane with an expression of absolute patience. "You were saying something about systems," he said. Crane had not heard the engines yet. He was still watching Dorothy, still running the calculation behind his glasses. The two dark-jacketed men near the entrance were on their phones. Norma behind the counter had not moved. Dorothy had heard the engines. Cole could tell by the way she shifted barely a fraction of an inch against his arm. And then very slowly, the trembling in her body changed character. It didn't stop. But it changed the way a fever changes when something in the body finally starts fighting back, the quality of it shifting from helpless to purposeful. Cole thought about Wendell. He didn't know Wendell. He didn't know this woman's name, she hadn't told him. And he hadn't asked because names in situations like this one are a courtesy that comes after trust, not before. He didn't know what kind of man had put that address on that envelope and left it inside a watch for his wife to find. He didn't know what kind of marriage produced a woman who would drive through a Nevada desert in a winter rainstorm to finish the thing her husband had started. He knew the envelope. He knew the address on it. He knew the look in the woman's eyes when she said Wendell's name, which was not the look of someone visiting a grave, but the look of someone finishing a sentence that someone else had begun. That was enough. Cole put the envelope inside his jacket, against his chest, zipped the jacket closed over it. Crane's eyes tracked the movement with the precise attention of someone watching something be removed from their reach. "That's not a good idea," Crane said. "Probably not," Cole agreed. Outside, the engines were getting louder. The neon sign flickered once in the wind. A glass on the counter walked slightly to the left across the surface, a tiny sound in an otherwise still room. Cole heard it clearly because he knew exactly what kind of vibration produced that kind of movement, and he knew what it meant. Crane heard it now too. His head turned slightly toward the front windows. Involuntary, the first involuntary thing Cole had seen him do, and in the pink-stained rain light coming through the glass. Something in Crane's face arrived at a calculation it didn't like. The parking lot exploded with light, headlights, dozens of them sweeping across the front windows in a wide arc as the motorcycles rolled in from the highway in tight formation. Big bikes, heavy touring machines built for the long American distances, chrome catching the neon and the rain and the overhead light, and scattering it in every direction at once. The sound of their engines filled the diner, the way a tide fills a harbor, completely from every direction simultaneously, so that the walls and the counter and the floor all seemed to share a single vibration. The vibration of machinery and intention, and the particular American democracy of men who ride together, choosing to stop here at this mile at this hour, in this rain. Crane was on his feet. The two dark-jacketed men near the entrance had taken a step back from the door, without appearing to decide to do so. Cole had not moved. He sat in the corner booth with his back against the wall, and the white envelope against his chest, and the white-haired woman on his left, and he looked at Victor Crane across the table. "You were explaining," Cole said quietly, "how systems work." The diner door swung open, and the first of the Iron Reapers stepped inside. The man who walked through the door first was not small. He stood 6'2" in his riding boots and carried somewhere in the neighborhood of 280 pounds, distributed across a frame that had spent decades doing things to it that a frame wasn't originally designed for. His beard was the color of iron ore, and his arms, where they emerged from the cut-off vest over a heavy flannel shirt, were covered in tattoos that had blurred slightly at the edges with age, the way old photographs blur, not losing their meaning, just acquiring the particular softness of things that have lasted long enough to become part of the landscape. The patch on the back of his vest matched Cole's. Iron Reapers. Below it, a bottom rocker that said Nomad. He pulled off his helmet and shook rain from his beard in a single economical motion, the way a large dog shakes water without self-consciousness or ceremony. Then he looked around the diner with the slow, thorough attention of a man who has entered enough unfamiliar rooms to understand that the first 30 seconds of looking tell you most of what you need to know about any situation. His eyes found Cole in the corner booth. His name was Russell Peterson, though no one who knew him had called him Russell in approximately 25 years. They called him Gravel for reasons that became obvious within about 4 seconds of hearing him speak. His voice had the texture of a road that had been repaved too many times, each layer slightly off from the one beneath it, producing something that was technically smooth, but communicated a long history of rough going. "Stone?" he said, and the word filled the diner the way the engines had filled the parking lot. Cole lifted his coffee mug slightly in acknowledgement. Gravel looked at the woman sitting beside Cole. He looked at the two dark-jacketed men near the entrance who were trying to appear casual and succeeding at it less with every passing second. He looked at Victor Crane, who was standing beside the table in his gray suit with the expression of a man who has just watched his chess game acquire new pieces that don't belong to either player and isn't sure yet what the rules are for that. Then he looked back at Cole. "We stopping here?" Gravel asked. "Looks that way," Cole said. Behind Gravel, the Iron Reapers were coming through the door in ones and twos, filling the diner with the smell of wet leather and cold air, and the ghost of long miles ridden in hard weather. They were not all large, but they were all present in the particular way that men who ride together over long distances become present, each one occupying his space with a settled, unhurried certainty, the way trees occupy a hillside. They spread through the room without noise beyond the necessary sounds of their entry, moving to the counter and the empty booths and the open spaces near the walls, reading the room the way Gravel had read it, and arriving at the same general conclusions without needing to discuss them. There were 23 of them. Cole knew because he counted. The two dark-jacketed men by the door had stopped pretending to be casual. They had become very still. Instead, the kind of stillness that is its own form of communication. Victor Crane remained standing beside the booth. He was not a man who lost his composure easily. Cole had established that much in the preceding 20 minutes. And he did not lose it now. But the room had changed in a way that was mathematical and undeniable. And Crane was clearly a man who understood mathematics. He looked at the bikers arranging themselves through the diner with the careful attention of someone running numbers he doesn't like but will not pretend add up differently than they do. Gravel had come to stand at the end of the corner booth. He looked down at Dorothy with an expression that Cole recognized because it was the expression that large-weathered, difficult men sometimes produced involuntarily in the presence of elderly women who were clearly in some kind of distress, an expression compounded of instinctive protectiveness and a slight helplessness like a big dog confronted with something too fragile for its paws. "You all right, ma'am?" Gravel asked. Dorothy looked up at him, despite everything, the wet hair, the soaked coat. The 3 months of sleepless preparation that had accumulated under her eyes like sediment. She looked at Gravel Peterson with complete composure and said, "I'm considerably better than I was 10 minutes ago." Gravel nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had suspected. Then he turned his attention to Crane, and the quality of his attention was the quality of weather, impersonal and total. "You got somewhere else to be?" Gravel asked. Crane's jaw tightened once. Then he made a decision that Cole could watch, being made a visible, deliberate recalculation, the mental equivalent of picking up your pieces and moving them to a different part of the board to buy time. He straightened. He adjusted his cuffs. "I'll be outside," he said. It was addressed to no one in particular, delivered with enough manufactured composure to almost suggest this had been his plan all along. He walked toward the door. The two dark-jacketed men fell in behind him, with the relief of people who have been standing in an uncomfortable position for too long. The door swung shut. Through the front windows, Cole watched them cross the parking lot to the black SUV and stand beside it in the rain, Crane with his phone already out. The diner breathed. Norma behind the counter set both hands flat on the surface and exhaled slowly. One of the Iron Reapers, a lean man in his 40s with a close-cropped beard and reading glasses hanging from his vest pocket, sat down at the counter and looked at Norma with the mild expectation of a man who has ridden a long way and would like coffee. Norma, who had the profound professional resilience of someone who has worked too many late shifts to be permanently disrupted by anything short of a natural disaster, picked up the coffee pot and began filling cups. The two college kids in the window booth were still frozen in place. The girl had her hand over her mouth. The boy was staring at the parking lot with the expression of someone in the process of reconsidering several life decisions simultaneously. Cole was watching Dorothy. She was looking at her hands, which were spread flat on the table in front of her, and she was breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been holding something in for a very long time and is now in the relative shelter of 23 Iron Reapers and a temporarily empty diner, allowing herself to begin setting it down. Gravel settled into the booth across from them without being invited, which was entirely consistent with his general approach to most situations. He folded his large arms on the table and looked at Dorothy with steady, simple attention. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he said, not to Cole, to Dorothy. Cole looked at her too. And this was the moment he could feel it the way you feel a shift in wind direction, before you can name what's different, when Dorothy Hayward stopped simply surviving the night and started doing the things she had driven through 3 hours of desert rain to do. She told them about Wendell. Not everything. Not all at once the story came out in the order that mattered, rather than the order that happened, which is how true stories are usually told by people who have lived through them, rather than people who have only observed them from a safe distance. It came out with the economy of something that has been carried a long time and is finally being set on a table where others can see it properly. Wendell Hayward had been an accountant for 35 years, not a glamorous occupation, Not the kind of work that generated stories at dinner parties or made people lean forward with interest at social gatherings. And Wendell had been fine with that, deeply honestly fine with it, which was one of the things Dorothy had loved about him from very early on. His capacity to find genuine satisfaction in the doing of a thing rather than the recognition of having done it. He had kept other people's numbers honest with the same quiet commitment he brought to everything else in his life, including their 55-year marriage, including the garden he tended in the back of their house in Elko, including the pocket watch he had carried since his father gave it to him the week before he died. A watch that had never kept accurate time, but which Wendell wound and carried and checked, regardless every single day of his adult life, because the watch had never been about the time. He had worked for the same accounting firm for the last 18 years of his career. The firm handled accounts for several large clients in the Nevada and Utah region, but its most significant and long-standing client was a real estate development company called Crane Holdings Incorporated in Delaware, with operating offices in Las Vegas and Reno. Victor Crane's company, Cole said. His father started it, Dorothy said. Victor took it over about 12 years ago. She said this without particular emphasis. It was a fact that preceded other facts, and she delivered it the way Wendell would have delivered it as a number, in a sequence connected to the numbers before and after it, meaningful in its position rather than in isolation. Wendell had noticed discrepancies in the Crane Holdings accounts approximately 26 months before he died. Small ones at first, the kind that could be attributed to clerical error, to the normal friction of large transactions, moving through multiple jurisdictions, to the occasional innocent misalignment that accounting work generated and then resolved in the course of normal review. He had flagged them internally. He had documented the flags. He had waited to see whether the review process produced corrections. The corrections did not come. The discrepancies did not diminish. They grew. And as they grew, their pattern became something that could not be attributed to clerical error or innocent misalignment, because error doesn't have architecture, and innocence doesn't repeat itself in the same configuration across dozens of separate transactions, spanning nearly a decade. What Wendell was looking at once he had assembled enough of the pieces to see the shape of the whole was not a mistake. It was a system. Real estate transactions involving parcels of land in 3 Nevada counties, Elko Lander and Nye, that appeared in the Crane Holdings records as active purchases, but which, when cross-referenced against county assessor records that Wendell had begun quietly accessing on his own time, corresponded to either empty desert land of minimal legitimate value, or in several cases to properties that had already changed hands before the Crane Holdings transaction date. Phantom purchases. Money going out through the front door of the company's legitimate accounts and returning through a network of shell entities incorporated in Nevada and Wyoming, laundered through the velocity of real estate transactions until it emerged clean and legally unimpeachable on the other side. The total Wendell had calculated across the full span of the transactions he had identified was $194 million. Gravel let out a slow breath through his nose. He didn't say anything. Neither did Cole. He came home one night, Dorothy said. I was already in bed. I heard him come in. I heard him go to the kitchen. I heard him sit down. And then I didn't hear anything else for a long time, which wasn't like him. She paused. So I got up. The rain was still coming down outside, though it had eased from its earlier ferocity into something more sustained and patient. The window nearest the booth was beaded with it, the droplets catching the pink of the neon sign and refracting it into small dim stars along the glass. He was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of him, and he was... She stopped, then started again. He was crying, quietly. He wasn't a man who cried easily. 55 years together, I could count those times on one hand. Cole was looking at the table. Gravel was looking at Dorothy. He looked up at me and he said, Dot, I found something, and I don't know what to do with it. And I said... She paused, and something moved briefly across her face. An expression that was not quite a smile, but was related to the particular expression of people remembering conversations they would give almost anything to have again. I said, "You do what you always do. You do the right thing." Because that was who he was. That was simply who he was. The silence in the diner was the particular silence of people choosing to hold still, out of respect rather than absence. Several of the iron reapers who were within earshot had stopped their quiet conversations. The counter stools were all full now, steam rising from coffee cups. "He contacted the FBI 4 months after that night," Dorothy said. "He didn't tell me right away he was trying to protect me from it. He met with an agent from the Las Vegas field office. He turned over copies of everything he had assembled. They took it seriously. They opened a file." She paused, but the evidence he had could only get them so far. They needed the documentation of the top of the chain, the name of the person who was ultimately directing the money and providing the political cover that kept it from being scrutinized. That name was in the accounts that were locked behind an encryption Wendell hadn't yet been able to fully access. "What name?" Gravel asked. "I'll get there," Dorothy said with the quiet authority of someone who has earned the right to tell a story in the order she has chosen. 3 months after his meeting with the FBI, 8 months after he first noticed the discrepancies, Wendell Hayward drove his car off Route 278, north of Carlin, Nevada, on a Tuesday morning in October. The Nevada Highway Patrol report cited wet roads and excessive speed. Wendell Hayward had driven that stretch of road for 11 years and had never once exceeded the speed limit, a fact that Dorothy had presented to the investigating officer, and that the investigating officer had recorded in his notes, and that had produced no change in the official finding. She had known the morning the patrol officer came to her door that it had not been an accident. She had known it the way she had known things about Wendell for 55 years, not from evidence, not from argument, but from the particular understanding that grows between two people who have spent decades paying careful attention to each other. An understanding that can register the presence of something wrong, the way an ear accustomed to a familiar sound can register its sudden absence. She had known. And for the first 2 weeks she had done nothing but mourn, because there is a period of grief that simply cannot be shortened or bypassed, that demands its full measure of time and will not be negotiated with, that must simply be lived through the way weather must be lived through. Then she had gotten up from the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where Wendell had sat with his papers and wept, and she had started thinking. "Wendell gave me something the week before he died," she said. "He didn't explain it. He just sat down with me at breakfast one morning, put his father's pocket watch on the table between us, looked at me for a long moment and said, 'Keep this close.'" She reached into the collar of her coat and drew out a watch on a worn chain, a hunter case pocket watch, gold scratched along the edges with the particular scratches of something carried daily for many decades. She set it on the table between them. "I've carried it every day since, inside my coat against my chest, every single day." Gravel looked at the watch. Cole looked at the watch. "Open it," Dorothy said. Cole picked it up. It was heavier than it should have been. Not dramatically, not enough to notice if you weren't already paying attention, but enough to register as a slight wrongness in the hand of someone accustomed to the weight of things. He pressed the crown, and the case sprang open. The watch face was old ivory, the hands ornate, the kind of workmanship that had required real time and real skill to produce. He turned it over to look at the movement through the display, back gears and springs in their arrested dance wound, but not running the watch, keeping its long characteristic silence. Cole looked more closely at the interior of the case. Along the edge where the casing met the movement, there was a slight irregularity, a seam where no seam should have been, barely perceptible, the kind of modification that someone who knew what they were looking for might locate, and that everyone else would carry for years without ever finding. Cole pressed the seam with his thumbnail. Something released very slightly, and a small compartment no larger than a book of matches revealed itself along the interior wall of the case. Inside it, held in place by a thin strip of foam cut precisely to size, was a USB drive smaller than a thumbnail. The diner was very quiet. He didn't tell me it was in there, Dorothy said. I didn't find it until 3 weeks after he was gone. I was cleaning the watch. He always cleaned it on Sunday mornings, so I cleaned it on a Sunday morning because it felt like the right thing to do, and I found it. She paused. He knew I would. He knew it would be me, and he knew I'd find it in my own time. He just needed to make sure it was somewhere I would eventually look. Cole looked at the tiny drive in the watch case and thought about a man who had carried his dead father's watch for 40 years without concerning himself that it never kept accurate time, and who had in the last weeks of his life chosen that same watch as the place to put the thing most worth protecting. The logic of it was quiet and complete. It was the kind of logic that didn't need to announce itself. The drive is encrypted, Dorothy said. I don't have the decryption key. The FBI does. It was the arrangement Wendell made with his contact at the field office. They hold the key, he holds the data, and neither is useful without the other. He set it up that way deliberately so that if something happened to him, the drive would need to come to them. And the only person who knew where the drive was, she looked at her hands, was me. Cole closed the watch case carefully. He looked at Dorothy. The envelope, he said, the one you gave me. It's not the evidence. No, she said. It's a letter explaining what the watch contains and where I'm bringing it. It's addressed to Agent Patricia Soule at the Las Vegas field office. She's the agent Wendell worked with. She looked at Cole directly. I need to get to Las Vegas tonight. Cole looked at Gravel. Gravel was looking at Dorothy with an expression that had settled beyond the initial assessment and arrived at something simpler and more solid, the expression of a man who has understood what kind of situation he has walked into and has quietly made his decision about which side of it he's on. The diner door opened. Not the front door, the staff entrance near the back that led to the parking lot from a different angle. Sheriff Dale Burkett came through it in his tan uniform with his hat damp from the rain and his hand not on his weapon, but not far from it either. He was 58 years old, thick through the chest, with a face that had once been handsome and had become merely solid with time, the way faces go when the things that animated them in youth are gradually replaced by other things, not always better ones. He looked around the diner. He looked at the iron reapers distributed through it. He looked at the corner booth. He did not look surprised by any of it, which told Cole that Crane had briefed him on what he was walking into before he came through the door. Evening, Burkett said to the room generally. Then he walked toward the corner booth. He stopped at the end of the table and looked at Cole with the assessing expression of a law enforcement officer evaluating a civilian who has complicated a situation. Then he looked at Dorothy, and whatever he had planned to say in his opening line appeared to lose some of its certainty when he saw her face. Dorothy Hayward was looking at him the way she had looked at Crane, with recognition, and with something that wasn't quite judgment but was related to it. The look of someone who has done the accounting and arrived at an answer she took no pleasure in finding. Mrs. Hayward, Burkett said. His voice had lost some of its official quality. Not all of it. Enough. Dale, she said, simply. The way you say a name when the name carries a history you'd both prefer not to examine too carefully in front of an audience. Burkett's jaw tightened slightly. I got a call about a disturbance out here. Some gentleman in the parking lot concerned about a family situation. Did they explain the family situation to you? Dorothy asked. They explained their version of it. Would you like to hear mine? Burkett looked at the 23 iron reapers not looking at him from various positions around the diner. He looked at Cole. He looked back at Dorothy. "I'd like this situation to resolve quietly," he said, "without further complications. There are gentlemen outside who are prepared to—" "I know what they are prepared to do," Dorothy said. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat. Burkett's hand moved. Cole's hand moved a fraction of a second faster, and Burkett registered it and recalculated in the space of about 2 seconds without anyone saying a word. Dorothy produced a single folded piece of paper. She unfolded it on the table, smoothed it flat with both hands, turned it so that it faced Burkett, and pushed it slightly toward him. Burkett looked down at it. His face did something complicated and involuntary. It was a bank statement, one page black and white printed from a PDF with the header of a bank in Carson City. The account holder's name was listed in the standard way, last name first. The name was Burkett, not Dale Burkett, his wife's name. The transfer Wendell had documented had been made 18 months earlier from a shell company called Meridian Property Advisors LLC, one of the entities in the network Dorothy had described, to an account in Beverly Burkett's name in the amount of $47,000. The memo field, which most people using accounts for illicit purposes had the good sense to leave blank, read consulting services rendered. Burkett stood at the end of the table for a long moment. The kind of moment that is longer than its clock measurement, that expands to contain everything happening inside it. Cole watched his face. He had seen men decide things, real decisions, the kind that cost something real and cannot be walked back. And he knew what it looked like from the outside. It looked like exactly what was happening on Dale Burkett's face right now. Not a public drama, not a confrontation with anything outside himself. Something quieter and more final than that. The look of a man who has been running from a specific thing for a long time and has arrived at the place where the road ends, not because he's been cornered, but because he has simply run out of road and is tired. And the thing he's been running from is standing right there looking at him with complete patience. "Wendell kept records," Dorothy said softly, not triumphantly. Gently, almost the way you tell someone something that's going to hurt them, but that they need to hear regardless. He kept all of them. It was what he did. Burkett looked at the paper for another long moment. Then he looked at Dorothy. Whatever he had come in prepared to do, whatever Crane had told him to do when the call came, was no longer something Burkett appeared to have access to. He folded the paper along its original crease. He did not hand it back to Dorothy. He put it in his shirt pocket and buttoned the flap over it with the mechanical attention of someone giving their hands a task while their mind does something else entirely. Then he put his hat back on his head, adjusted it slightly, and walked back toward the side door. He paused with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. "There is a federal field office contact form on the Nevada DOJ website," he said to the wall, "for reporting financial crimes of a multi-jurisdictional nature. Submission goes directly to the appropriate department without passing through local infrastructure." A pause. "In case anyone needed to know that." He went out. The door closed behind him. Through the window, Cole watched him cross the parking lot away from the black SUV toward his patrol car, which he got into and drove away without stopping to speak to Crane or either of the dark-jacketed men. The diner held its breath for a moment. Gravel, who had sat through all of it with the patience of a man accustomed to very long distances, picked up the coffee that Norma had placed at his elbow at some point without anyone noticing the transaction, and took a slow sip. "So," he said, "Las Vegas." "Las Vegas," Dorothy confirmed. Cole looked at the watch in his hands. He was thinking about a man sitting at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, weeping over papers. He was thinking about the particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside, that looks from the outside like nothing more than a man doing his job carefully, keeping honest numbers, documenting what he found, carrying a watch that didn't keep time because it had belonged to his father. He set the watch down on the table, and Dorothy picked it up immediately and put it back inside her collar. And the gesture was so practiced, so automatic, so completely integrated into the ordinary movement of her body, that Cole understood she had been making that gesture every day for 3 months. "You've been carrying it the whole time," he said. "Every day," she said. "Through all of this." "He trusted me with it," she said, simply as a complete sentence, as a thing that required no elaboration or defense. "He trusted me with it. Therefore I carried it." That was the whole of the logic, and it was sufficient. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When you walked into this diner tonight, the SUV was already here." Dorothy looked at the table. "Yes." "That means they knew where you were going before you arrived." A pause. "Yes." "How?" She looked at him. "The car has a tracking device. Crane's people installed it sometime in the past few months. Roy found it when he swept the Buick." Cole processed this. "Roy," he said. "Someone I have helping me," Dorothy said. And there was something deliberate in the way she said it. Not evasive exactly, but careful, offering enough to be honest without offering more than was necessary at this particular moment. "Someone who's been inside Crane's operation for several weeks. He found the tracker and told me about it." "And you left it on the car?" "I left it on the car," she said. "Because if Victor knew I was coming here, he would come here. And here was where I needed him to come." She looked at Cole steadily. "I couldn't go to the FBI alone. I'm a 74-year-old woman with a pocket watch and a letter. If Crane found me before I got to Las Vegas and took the watch, there would be nothing left. No evidence, no witness, no case." She paused. "I needed a place to stand. A place where there would be people he couldn't simply remove." She glanced briefly at the iron reapers around them. "I chose this diner because it's a known stop on this route. I came on this night because I had reason to believe it would be a busy one. I hoped. I didn't know." Cole sat with this. He looked at Gravel. Gravel was looking at Dorothy with the expression of a man who has just significantly revised his assessment of the situation he's in. "How long have you been planning all of this?" Cole asked. Dorothy looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. "From the morning they came to my door and told me Wendell was gone," she said. "I cried for 2 weeks. Then I got up and I started planning." A pause. He wouldn't have done it any differently. Outside, the rain continued to fall. In the parking lot, the black SUV sat under the overhead light with its engine off now, which was a change from earlier. Crane and the two dark-jacketed men were visible through the front window, standing beside it, one of them on the phone. "He's calling somebody," Gravel said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "Somebody bigger than the local sheriff." "Yes," Dorothy said. "His name is Gerald Moss. He's been a United States Senator from Nevada for 16 years. Before that, he was in the state legislature for 8. He has a long reputation as a friend to business development in rural counties, land use policy, zoning, water rights. The kind of issues that don't make national news but that determine very specifically which parcels of desert become worth money and which ones don't. And he determined that in favor of Crane Holdings," Cole said, "consistently over 10 years across 3 different county jurisdictions in ways that were never individually large enough to constitute a visible pattern, but that collectively." She paused. "Wendell used to say that individual numbers could lie, but patterns couldn't. He said a pattern was just the truth that the numbers were pointing at when you lined them all up and stepped back far enough to see where they were pointing." Cole looked at the front windows. Crane had his phone to his ear, and his other hand was making a small controlled gesture in the air. The gesture of a man delivering information to someone who requires it in a specific format. The two dark-jacketed men stood beside the SUV and watched the diner with the patience of men who have been told that patience is what is currently required of them. When he makes that call, Cole said, "How long do we have?" Dorothy thought about it with the precision of someone who has thought about it before, who has run the numbers in the small hours of nights that stretch too long and too quiet. "Not long enough to be comfortable," she said. "Long enough to move if we move now." Cole looked at Gravel. Gravel set down his coffee mug. Outside, Crane's phone call was still ongoing. The neon sign above the diner's front windows hummed and flickered. The rain had found its pace now steady and committed the long kind that settles in for the duration and does not apologize for the imposition. Dorothy Hayward sat in the corner booth of the Desert Star Diner with her hand pressed to the watch at her collar, and she was not trembling anymore. The plan was simple because simple plans survive contact with the road, and complicated ones rarely do. Cole would ride with Dorothy in Wendell's Buick. He wasn't leaving her in a car alone with what she was carrying. Not with Crane still in the parking lot, and a phone call already made to someone larger. Gravel and 8 of the Iron Reapers would ride ahead, spread across the highway in a moving perimeter. The remaining 15 would follow behind close enough to matter far enough to see the whole picture. They would take Highway 50 west to US 93 south, then straight down into Las Vegas, 4 hours in clean conditions longer tonight with the rain and the dark and whatever Victor Crane was setting in motion, while he stood beside his SUV with his phone pressed to his ear. It was not a complicated plan, Cole thought as he settled into the passenger seat of the old Buick and adjusted his position to account for a seat set for someone 8 inches shorter than him, that it was exactly the kind of plan Wendell Hayward would have approved of. Direct, honest about what it was, not reaching for more cleverness than the situation required. Dorothy pulled out of the Desert Star Diner parking lot at 12:47 in the morning, without looking at the black SUV still sitting under the overhead light. Cole watched it in the side mirror as the Buick turned onto the highway. Crane and the 2 dark-jacketed men stood beside it, watching them go. Crane had his phone at his side now, which meant the call was finished, which meant whatever he had arranged was already in motion. The Iron Reapers rolled out behind and ahead of them in the rain, their headlights cutting the dark in parallel lines. And for a few miles everything was just the sound of engines and rain, and the particular feeling of a convoy that has committed to a direction and cannot be uncommitted from it. Dorothy drove the way Wendell had driven, both hands on the wheel, steady speed eyes ahead. Cole watched the darkness outside his window and the side mirror alternately tracking the headlights behind them, counting the ones that belonged to Iron Reapers and watching for ones that didn't. "Tell me about Moss," Cole said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. The wiper blades kept their rhythm. "Gerald Moss has been a United States Senator from Nevada for 16 years, she said. Before that, he was in the state legislature for 8. He built his reputation as a friend to rural business development, land use zoning, water rights allocation, the kind of legislation that doesn't make national news, but that has enormous practical effect on which pieces of Nevada desert become worth developing and which ones stay worthless. He directed that legislation consistently and systematically in favor of parcels that Crane Holdings was positioned to acquire. Crane got the approvals, the regulatory interference stayed minimal, and the money cycled through the phantom transactions and came out clean on the other side. And Moss gets what, campaign money or something more direct? Both through layers he can't be directly connected to. And Protection Crane has documentation that could expose Moss if Crane ever needed leverage. They're locked to each other. That's the part Wendell said took him the longest to understand. It wasn't just corruption, it was mutual assured silence. Neither of them can move against the other without destroying themselves. The lock can only be opened from the outside. Cole watched the dark highway unspooling in the headlights. The first of Gravel's bikes were visible a quarter-mile ahead, red taillights steady in the rain. Wendell was the outside, Cole said. Wendell was the outside, Dorothy said, and then he was gone, And the question became, she paused. The question became who else was the outside? Who else was positioned to carry what he'd collected to the people who needed it without being inside the lock themselves? You, Cole said. Me, she said. A 74-year-old woman from Elko who used to teach third grade and grows roses in her backyard and has never been inside a federal building in her life. She said it without irony or self-deprecation, simply as a fact stated clearly. Victor would never have thought it was me. That was the only advantage I had, so I used it. They drove in silence for a while. The desert on both sides of the highway was invisible in the rain, and the dark just blackness beyond the reach of the headlights. And the white dashes in the center of the road came steadily toward them, and passed beneath, and disappeared behind. And Cole found something almost meditative in the rhythm of it. They had been on the road for 22 minutes when Gravel's voice came through the radio Cole had clipped to his jacket. A short-range unit Gravel had pressed into his hand in the diner parking lot, with the economy of a man who has coordinated movement in difficult terrain before. "Got something?" Gravel said. His voice had the texture of its name over the radio static. "Two vehicles sitting perpendicular across the two-lane about a mile and a half ahead. Not accident positioning, intentional." Cole looked at Dorothy. She was looking at the road. "How many people?" Cole asked into the radio. "Can't confirm yet. Dark jackets couple visible outside the vehicles. More inside probably." Cole turned to Dorothy. "Did you know this was going to happen?" She kept her eyes on the road. "I knew it might. Victor doesn't give up when things don't go his way on the first attempt. He never has." "How do you know how he responds to setbacks?" A pause. The wipers beat their count. "His father and Wendell were colleagues for 20 years. I've known Victor since he was a teenager. I watched his father hand him the company." Another pause, quieter. "That's the part that hurt Wendell most, more than the money, more than the danger. He said it felt like watching someone you helped raise become something you can no longer recognize." Cole keyed the radio. "Can you go around?" "Desert shoulders soft from the rain. Bikes might manage. The car won't." Cole looked at Dorothy. She was still driving at the same speed, both hands on the wheel. He was thinking, and what he was thinking about was not the blockade itself. That was a static problem, and static problems had roots usually. He was thinking about how the vehicles had gotten there. 22 minutes from the diner, they had been positioned at a precise distance far enough from the Desert Star to be outside the immediate situation, close enough to intercept before the convoy had built real momentum. That required prior knowledge of the route and prior positioning. The vehicles hadn't been dispatched from somewhere distant in the last 20 minutes. They had been waiting, standing by somewhere along this highway for a signal to close the gap, which meant Crane had known or strongly suspected that Dorothy would try to go south toward Las Vegas. He had prepared for this route before he ever walked into the diner, which meant he had known about Agent Soul, which meant he knew considerably more about Wendell's arrangement with the FBI than Dorothy knew he knew. Cole filed that and set it aside. There would be time to understand all of it later. He keyed the radio again. "Gravel, how many bikes can you put on the road between here and those vehicles right now?" "All 23 if you need them." "Put 6 out front, spread wide high beams. I want it to look like more than 6. Everybody else hold back." He paused. "Tell them we're slowing down but not stopping." "Copy." Cole looked at Dorothy. "When I tell you, give me everything this car has." Dorothy looked at him for the first time since they'd gotten in. Then she looked back at the road. "Wendell drove this car for 11 years yet," she said. "It has more in it than people expect." The 6 bikes spread wide across the highway ahead, high beams blazing through the rain, and Cole watched through the windshield as the scene at the blockade became visible two black SUVs parked at angles across both lanes. Three figures outside them in the headlight glare. Stiff-postured men who had expected something and were now receiving something different from what they'd planned for. The widespread of the bike headlights made the approaching convoy look considerably larger than it was, the way any fire looks larger in the dark. One of the figures stepped forward, stopped, said something to the man beside him. The man beside him turned toward the SUVs. Cole was watching the lead vehicle on the right side of the blockade. It was parked with its nose angled toward the road shoulder, rather than directly across the lane, which meant its exit angle was toward the shoulder, which meant if its driver decided to move it, he'd need to reverse first before pulling forward. An extra variable, an extra second. He was about to key the radio again when the lead SUV on the right side of the blockade did something entirely unexpected. Its full headlights came on, not parking lights. Full headlights blazing into the wet asphalt. And then the vehicle moved forward slowly, deliberately pulling its nose away from the blockade and opening a gap on the right side of the highway. Not quite a full lane. Enough in a car driven by someone with a steady hand and precise judgment of width to get through. Cole stared at the gap. The three figures who had been standing outside the vehicles were now shouting, their voices inaudible through the rain and the glass and the distance, but their body language loud and clear, arms gesturing toward the SUV that had moved one of them on a phone. The other two taking urgent stumbling steps toward the repositioned vehicle with the unmistakable movement of people whose plan has just been modified from the inside by someone they thought was on their side. "Go," Cole said. Dorothy gave the Buick everything it had. The car accelerated with the authority of American engineering from another era, not fast by any modern measure, but steady and committed like a large river, finding its channel confident once it had found its direction. The gap in the blockade was real, and Dorothy drove through it without hesitation and without touching the brakes. Her hands on the wheel with the same steady certainty she had brought to everything else this night. And then they were through, and the blockade was behind them. Gravel's voice came through the radio. "Clear, all coming through." Cole turned in his seat and looked back through the rear window. The Iron Reapers were threading through the gap, single file fast the whole column, moving through the narrow opening, with the focused efficiency of riders who know how to move together in a tight space. Behind them, in the red wash of taillights, the three figures from the blockade stood in the rain and watched. No pursuit, no second set of vehicles coming from behind. Cole faced forward. The highway stretched out ahead of them, dark and wet, and opened the desert on both sides, invisible in the rain. He looked at Dorothy. She was breathing steadily. Her hands were at the same position on the wheel they had always been. "That vehicle that moved," Cole said. "The one that opened the gap." "Yes," Dorothy said. "That wasn't Crane's man." "No," she said. "It wasn't." Cole waited. "His name is Roy Etten," Dorothy said. "He's a private investigator based in Reno. I hired him 8 weeks ago. I needed someone inside, someone who could tell me what Victor was planning, where his people were positioned, and critically what he knew about Wendell's arrangement with the FBI. She paused. Roy spent 6 weeks building a cover as a contract security consultant. Crane's organization hired him 3 weeks ago. He's been inside since then. Cole sat with this. He thought about what Dorothy had said at the diner. "I didn't come tonight without some help already in place." He thought about how carefully she had distributed what she shared, and when she shared it, keeping each piece of information in its proper place, releasing it when it served its purpose and not before. The same discipline Wendell had applied to the accounting. The same instinct for what information meant when placed in sequence. He's been feeding information to Agent Soul. Dorothy continued. "Through me. Roy doesn't know the full picture. He knows enough to do his job. And his job tonight was to be where he needed to be when I needed him to be there. She paused. He was the one who told me 11 days ago that Victor had found the tracker on the Buick and was planning to use it. Roy found the tracker when he first swept my car and reported it up to Crane as expected. Crane knew about it. So did I. So you both knew about the tracker, Cole said. And we both used it, Dorothy said, for different purposes. Cole looked out the windshield at the road and the rain and the steady red taillights of the bikes ahead. He was thinking about a 74-year-old woman from Elko who used to teach third grade and grows roses in her backyard, who had spent 3 months assembling a counter-operation against the people who killed her husband, using the tools available to her, distributing information, carefully choosing her ground, trusting the right people at the right moments. He thought about Wendell, sitting at that kitchen table weeping over papers, and what it meant that this was the woman he had trusted with the watch. He thought he understood now. Roy flagged the route surveillance points the day before you left, Cole said. The morning before I left, Dorothy said. He told me where they were most likely to have vehicles positioned and in what configuration. That's how I knew the gap on the right side would be the one to take. She glanced at Cole briefly. I didn't know for certain that he'd be in the right vehicle at the right moment. I knew he'd try to be. He was, Cole said. He was, Dorothy said. They drove. The miles went under them the way miles go in the desert at night, without landmarks, without reference, the darkness and the rain making the world into a single continuous present with no edges. And then, after a time, the sky to the south began to show the first evidence of the light pollution that precedes a large city. A pale brownish-orange glow spread along the horizon like a bruise, and Cole knew they were getting close. He picked up the radio. Gravel. Still here? We're going to the FBI field office on Warm Springs Road. I'll find it. Anyone still back there? A pause. Had a tail pick us up about 40 miles back. Fell off when we changed approach at the junction. Roy's doing probably. Another pause. Smart man, whoever he is. Yeah, Cole said. The FBI Las Vegas field office on Warm Springs Road did not look at 3:45 in the morning, like a place where anything significant happened. It looked like what it was, a federal building in a business district, concrete and glass discrete, the kind of building designed to be present without being conspicuous. A guard station at the entrance. Lights on inside despite the hour because certain kinds of work don't accommodate the sun's schedule. Roy Etten was already there when they pulled in. He was leaning against a rental car in the parking lot, compact, nondescript. Nothing like the SUVs he'd been driving for Crane's operation. And he was a compact, nondescript man himself, the specific kind of face that nature occasionally produces for the work of not being remembered. 50s medium, built a plain rain jacket. He straightened when the Buick pulled in and gave Dorothy a single nod that contained what might have been weeks of complicated professional experience compressed into one gesture of simple acknowledgement. Dorothy nodded back. The Iron Reapers rolled in behind them and arranged themselves through the parking lot with the patient formation of people who have come a long way and are content to wait as long as necessary. Gravel cut his engine and sat on his bike with his arms folded, looking at the federal building with the equanimity of a man for whom government architecture has never been particularly impressive. Agent Patricia Soule met them at the security entrance. She was younger than Cole had expected, early 40s, dark hair, pulled back, practically wearing the carefully composed expression of a federal agent, which was its own kind of face, trained and deliberate. But when she saw Dorothy coming through the rain toward her, something in the composition shifted, and what came through underneath it was the expression of a person who has been working toward a specific moment for a long time and is now watching it arrive exactly as hoped. Mrs. Hayward, she said. Patricia, Dorothy said. They didn't embrace. They stood in the rain looking at each other, and the look between them was the look of two people who have conducted a long collaboration at a distance and are now for the first time in the same physical space. There was acknowledgement in it, the particular kinship of people who have been working toward the same thing from different sides of the same wall. "Come inside," Soul said. The conference room was fluorescent lit with a table and chairs and a whiteboard that had been recently erased but not quite completely, faint ghost marks of previous writing, still visible on its surface like the traces of a conversation that had almost been erased. Cole sat against the wall. Roy Etten sat across the table, quiet hands folded with the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting rooms. Dorothy sat at the head of the table with the pocket watch in her hands. She set it on the table. She opened it. She removed the USB drive from its hidden compartment and held it in her palm for a moment. This small thing, smaller than a thumbnail that Wendell had spent 2 years building, and then she set it on the table in front of Agent Soul. Soul looked at it. She picked it up carefully. She looked at Dorothy. "You know what this contains," Soul said. "Wendell told me near the end," Dorothy said. "Not everything. Enough." Soul nodded. She opened a laptop already on the table and inserted the drive. Her fingers moved over the keyboard, entering the decryption key. Cole understood the piece of the arrangement that Wendell had placed with the FBI rather than with Dorothy, so that neither half was complete without the other. A security architecture built by a man who had spent his professional life understanding how things balanced. The room was very quiet. Soul's expression changed as she read. "Not dramatically, federal agents don't do dramatic." But her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible adjustment. The physical response to information arriving at a weight that has been calculated and anticipated, but still lands differently than the calculation prepared you for. "He got all of it," Soul said quietly, to herself as much as to the room. "He always did," Dorothy said. Soul scrolled. Her eyes moved with the quick, absorptive attention of someone who reads financial documents, the way other people read stories, following the through line, tracking the characters, arriving at the conclusion the numbers have been pointing toward all along. 47 transactions, Soul said, fully documented. Transfer records, shell entity registrations, the county assessor cross-references. She paused. "And the Moss communications." "Yes," Dorothy said. "He has direct communications from Moss to Crane. Email records from the senator's personal account." Wendell said Moss was meticulous about everything official and careless about the personal account, Dorothy said. "He thought personal meant private." Soul looked at Dorothy. "This is enough," she said. Not expansively, not with the enthusiasm of someone delivering good news in a movie, just clearly as a statement of professional assessment. "This is sufficient to bring the case, for Crane and for Moss." Dorothy nodded. She didn't say anything. She was looking at the watch on the table. Cole leaned forward slightly. "There's one more thing you should know," he said. Soul looked at him. When Crane came into the diner tonight, he produced a photograph on his phone. He claimed to be Mrs. Hayward's son. The photograph showed her with him in front of a house. And, Soul said, the photograph was digitally manipulated. The central figures were mirrored horizontally. Mrs. Hayward was wearing her pearl necklace in its natural position, shifted slightly to the right. In the photograph, it appeared on the left. The background was left untouched, so the shadows looked natural, but the figures had been flipped. Cole paused. "That's not something a man does with a photograph of his own mother. It's something you do when you're constructing a document to serve a specific purpose, and you don't have access to the real image you need." Soul looked at him for a moment. Then she made a note. "That goes into the record," she said. "It speaks directly to premeditation and to the degree of preparation behind the intimidation effort." She looked at Dorothy. "Did you retain the photograph?" "He showed it on his phone," Dorothy said. "He didn't leave it behind." "The phone records will get it," Soul said. "Once we have the warrant." She returned to the laptop, made additional notes, and then went still. Cole could see from his angle against the wall that she had found something she hadn't been looking for. The quality of her attention changed. The quick professional absorption shifted to something slower, more careful, something that required more of her. "Mrs. Hayward," she said. Dorothy looked up. "There's an audio file on this drive." Dorothy went very still. "It's labeled with your name," Soul said. The room was completely still. Roy Etten was looking at the table. Cole was looking at Dorothy. Soul turned the laptop slowly so the screen faced Dorothy. A simple media player on the screen, an audiophile icon, and the label beside it was two words in a file name that Wendell had typed at some point during the last week of his life. For Dot. Dorothy looked at it for a long time. Her hand came to rest on the table beside the watch. She looked at the file name, and then at the watch, and then at the file name again. Then she reached out and pressed play. The audio was recorded on a phone. You could hear the slight ambient sound of a room behind it. The faint hiss of digital compression around the edges of the silence before the voice began. But the voice was clear. It was the voice of a man in his late 70s, quiet and deliberate, with the cadence of someone who has organized his thoughts with great care and is delivering them in the order that matters. "If you're hearing this," Wendell said, "it means I didn't make it home." The room held the words. "And it means you found the watch. Which means you did the thing I knew you'd do, which is the thing you've always done. You kept going. You kept going when it was hard, and you kept going when it didn't make sense to, and you kept going past every reasonable point at which a person would be forgiven for stopping, and you got to the end of it." A pause. The ambient sound of a room. "I want you to know that I knew you would. I have known you for 57 years. Dorothy Marie Hayward and I have never once in those 57 years seen you fail to finish a thing you started." Cole looked at the wall. His jaw was set. He was aware that his hands resting on his knees had tightened. "The people at the FBI will take it from here." Wendell continued. "Patricia is good at her job. She'll know what to do with all of it. You don't need to worry about the next part. The next part is theirs." Another pause. Longer. "The part I want you to think about is what comes after. When this is done and you've driven home and you've put the watch back on the mantel where it belongs, I want you to sit in the garden. Our garden. I want you to sit there and not think about any of this for a while. Just sit there. The roses were looking good this fall. I was proud of those roses." Dorothy made a sound, small and immediate. Her hand came up to her mouth and pressed against it. "I need you to know that I didn't do any of this alone," Wendell said. "I want to be completely clear about that. I was never going to be alone in it because I knew you. I knew that if it came to this, if I couldn't finish it myself, I knew exactly who would pick it up. I knew exactly who would carry it the rest of the way. I didn't worry about it." A pause. "I want you to know that, Dot. I didn't worry about it because I knew it was you. I've always known it was you." A pause. The quiet hiss of the recording. "I love you. I'll love you from wherever I end up for as long as that kind of thing keeps working." Another pause. The last one. "Take care of those roses." The file ended. The room stayed with it. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent light hummed its small institutional hum. Somewhere in the building, distant and separate, a door opened and closed, and the sound of it came through the walls belonging to a completely different world than the one inside this conference room. Dorothy's hand came down from her mouth slowly. She looked at the laptop screen. Then she looked at the pocket watch on the table. She reached out and closed the case with a gentle, deliberate click, and she held it in both hands for a moment, and then she placed it in her coat pocket. Not the inside pocket where it had lived against her chest for 3 months, but the outer pocket, the ordinary pocket The one where you put things you no longer need to protect from the world, but simply want to keep close. She looked at Agent Soul. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was level and clear. "Now I make calls," Soul said. "The U.S. Attorney's Office will need to be briefed tonight. We'll move quickly on Crane before he can begin creating distance from what happened tonight. His actions at the diner, the blockade on the highway, all of it is documented, and it all goes into what's already on this drive." She paused. "Moss is more complicated. A sitting senator requires a specific process. But the documentation you've brought us," she shook her head slightly, "he won't be sitting much longer." "Victor," Dorothy said, "when will he be arrested?" "We'll have the warrant before morning," Soul said. "He'll know it's coming the moment our first call to the U.S. Attorney goes through. He has enough contacts to feel that wind start to blow. But there's nowhere to go that matters. The documentation is here now." She looked at Dorothy. "He can run from a lot of things. He can't run from 47 transactions and 12 years of emails." Dorothy nodded. "I'll need detailed statements from everyone present tonight," Soul said. "Mrs. Hayward, of course, and Mr. Etten, and—" She looked at Cole. "Cole Maddox," Cole said. "Mr. Maddox and the others who were at the diner. That's 23 people with fairly developed opinions about formal proceedings," Cole said. 24 witnesses to an attempted abduction, a fraudulent identity claim, the intimidation of a federal cooperant, and the deliberate vehicular obstruction on a state highway, Soul said. "There's a legal difference between those things." Cole considered this, then he nodded. The statements took 2 hours. Outside, as the process wound through its necessary stages, formed recordings, the patient bureaucratic architecture of making informal truth into formal record. The night was finishing. The rain had stopped. The sky over the eastern mountains had begun its long early morning shift from black to deep blue. The particular blue that exists only in the 30 minutes before sunrise when the light hasn't arrived yet. But the darkness has already begun its retreat. Cole walked out through the front entrance of the FBI field office and stood in the parking lot in the cool post-rain air. The Iron Reapers were still there. Some sat on their bikes, some stood beside them. Gravel was sitting on the hood of a car that did not belong to him. Roy Etten's rental, Cole noticed, drinking coffee from a paper cup that someone had produced from somewhere, and he raised the cup when Cole came out. "Soul is filing," Cole said. "Crane Warren before morning. Moss is next." Gravel drank his coffee. Good. Cole stood in the morning air. He felt the particular quality of something completed, not the triumphant feeling that stories sometimes assign to moments like this one, but something quieter and more honest. The feeling of a weight that has been carried a long way finally being set down. The muscles still remembering the shape of what they held, even after it was gone. He was thinking about the warrant, about Victor Crane waking up this morning, in whatever hotel room he'd retreated to, or in whatever car he was sleeping in, or still driving somewhere with the windows up and the radio off making calculations. About the phone call that would come from his attorneys in a few hours, the one that would tell him what he already suspected but hadn't allowed himself to accept. About what it looked like when a system built on mutual assured silence finally ran out of road. He was thinking about a man in a gray suit who had stood in a desert diner and talked about systems, and about how systems that depend on silence are only as strong as the silence itself, and about what happens when the silence is finally broken by the one person inside it who was strong enough to carry the key to the outside. He was thinking about Wendell. The building door opened behind him, and Dorothy came out. She was still in the soaked wool coat which had partially dried in the warmth of the conference room, but retained the particular shapelessness of fabric that has been thoroughly rained on. Her white hair had dried into its natural wave. She was carrying the pocket watch in her right hand, closed, held loosely. Now the way you carry something you've stopped being afraid to lose because it belongs to you completely. And that fact is no longer in question. She stood beside Cole in the parking lot, and they both looked at the morning sky for a moment. The Iron Reapers, 23 of them, watched from their positions around the lot with the respectful attention of a group that understands when a moment is happening and that the correct response to a moment is to let it happen without interruption. "They need me back at the office this afternoon," Dorothy said. "Sol wants to walk through the full documentation with me. Make sure she has the context right for the filing." Cole nodded. "After that," Dorothy said, "I'm going to drive home to Elko." "Long drive alone," Cole said. "I've been driving alone for 3 months," she said. "I think I can manage another 3 hours." She paused. "The roses need looking at. I've been neglecting the garden." Cole looked at the mountains in the distance, their tops still holding the last remnants of the storm, the sun just clearing them to the east, and turning the snow on the highest peaks into something that caught the light and held it. The desert floor, where the rain had washed everything clean, had the particular luminous quality that arrives only in the early morning after a hard rain, when the air is still and clear, and everything is exactly what it is, and nothing more. "When you sat down in that booth last night," Cole said, "I thought you were the most frightened person I'd ever seen." Dorothy looked at the watch in her hand. "I was," she said. "You didn't act like it." "Being frightened and acting frightened are two different things," she said. "Wendell taught me that. He was frightened too at the end, very frightened. He just kept doing the next thing anyway, the thing in front of him, the thing that needed to be done, one thing after the other." She closed her hand more fully around the watch. "That's all courage is. It's not the absence of fear. It's doing the next thing when you're frightened enough to not do it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like he was a good man," he said. Dorothy looked at the sky. "He was the best man I ever knew," she said, as a fact delivered without decoration, the way the best facts always are. "I was lucky enough to spend 55 years figuring that out fully, which is a kind of luck most people don't get." A pause. "I knew I was lucky the whole time. I just didn't know the full measure of it until it was gone." "You never do." She held out her hand to Cole. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it in both of his, which made her hand disappear almost entirely, and they stood like that. This enormous bearded man in his iron patch vest, holding the hand of a 74-year-old woman in a damp wool coat in a federal office parking lot in Las Vegas at 7 in the morning, while 23 motorcycles watched from a respectful distance, and the handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually last, because it was not really a handshake. It was the acknowledgement of something that didn't have a clean name, the kind of connection that forms between strangers in the specific pressure of shared difficulty and leaves a mark that easier acquaintance never could. "Thank you," Dorothy said, "for doing the next thing." Cole released her hand. He looked at the morning sky for a moment. Then he looked at his boots. Then he looked at Gravel Peterson sitting on someone else's car hood drinking his coffee, with the unhurried patience of a man who has ridden long enough to know that the riding always continues, and there is no particular urgency to begin when the moment in front of you deserves to be finished first. Cole felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for longer than he could easily account for. Longer than last night. Longer than the phone call he'd gotten 7 days ago about his brother, who was waiting in a funeral home in Reno. Longer even than that. Something that had been wound tight through years of accumulation, the specific tightness of a person who has spent a long time watching the world do what it does to people and has not always found it possible to intervene, and who has developed in response to that impossibility a controlled and careful distance from things that would cost him something to engage with. Something in that distance had closed tonight. He wasn't sure when exactly, somewhere between a woman's hand on his arm and a pocket watch opening on a diner table, and a voice on an audio file saying, "I didn't worry about it because I knew it was you." But it had closed, and the space where it had been was not empty. It was occupied by something warmer, something that didn't have a name but felt in the clear morning air of a Nevada city after a long desert night like something worth keeping. "Grandsons are supposed to look out for their grandmas," he said. Dorothy smiled. It was a full smile, real and unmanaged, the first one he had seen from her, rising out of whatever had been holding it back since before she walked through the door of the Desert Star Diner in the rain. It transformed her face the way morning light transforms a landscape, completely making visible what had always been there, just waiting for the right conditions. She turned and walked back into the building. Cole stood in the parking lot. He stood there for a moment in the early morning air, with the post-rain smell of clean desert around him, and the mountains going gold in the east, and the sound of 23 motorcycle engines beginning to wake up one by one, first one, and then another, and then several at once, each one adding its voice to the collective sound, until the parking lot held the full rumbling conversation of machines ready to move. Roy Etten came out of the building behind Cole and stopped beside him. They stood together for a moment without speaking, the way men who have been part of the same difficult night sometimes stand when the night is over. "She's going to be all right," Roy said. "Yeah," Cole said. "She was going to be all right regardless," Roy said. "From the beginning. I figured that out about 2 weeks in." He paused. "Wendell knew who he was married to." "He did," Cole said. Roy nodded once. He got in his rental car and drove away without looking back, the way professional people leave when the job is finished, and there is nothing left to do but let the work stand on its own. Gravel came to stand beside Cole. He looked at the building for a moment. Then he looked at the road. "Reno," he said. "Reno," Cole said. They walked back to their bikes. The Iron Reapers were mounting up around them, helmets going on kickstands, lifting the collective preparations of men who have been still long enough and are now ready for the motion that is their natural state. The sound of the engines built on itself in the parking lot of the Federal Field Office on Warm Springs Road in Las Vegas, Nevada, on a morning in November, when the rain had passed and the sky was the particular clean blue that follows a hard desert storm. Cole settled onto his bike. He put on his helmet. He looked at the road ahead. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early December, a story ran on the front page of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, under a headline that people in Nevada read twice before they believed it. Victor Crane, managing partner of Crane Holdings, LLC, had been arrested on 47 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, following a joint investigation by the FBI's Las Vegas Field Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Nevada. Bail had been denied on the grounds that the defendant represented a significant flight risk, given the scale of the assets involved and the documented pattern of resource use for the purpose of intimidation and evidence suppression. The arrest had been made at 5:47 in the morning at a hotel in Henderson. Crane had been in the process of packing a bag when the agents arrived, which the arresting report noted in its factual, non-editorial way, and which communicated everything it needed to communicate without editorializing. The story ran 6 paragraphs before it got to the senator. United States Senator Gerald Moss of Nevada had announced through his attorneys that he would not seek re-election at the conclusion of his current term, and that he would be cooperating fully with federal investigators regarding certain financial matters about which he had recently been made aware. His attorneys had described this cooperation as proactive and comprehensive, which was the kind of language that attorneys use when the evidence against their client is sufficiently complete that the only remaining question is how gracefully the damage can be managed. Sources within the U.S. Attorney's Office, speaking on background, used the phrase "substantial exposure" when describing the senator's situation, and noted that cooperation, while welcome, rarely altered the fundamental mathematical reality of documented multi-jurisdictional financial crimes spanning a decade. The story mentioned in its final 3 paragraphs that the investigation had been broken open by documentary evidence provided to the FBI's Las Vegas field office by the widow of a Reno area accountant, whose death, previously classified as a traffic accident, was now being reinvestigated by the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation as a potential homicide. The accountant had been a cooperating federal witness in an active investigation at the time of his death. The story did not mention the widow's name. Dorothy had asked them not to. There was a smaller story in the same edition deeper in the paper about a vehicular obstruction incident on Highway 50 in the early morning hours of the same night that Crane had been located at the Desert Star Diner. The story noted that the incident had involved 2 vehicles and several individuals currently cooperating with investigators and that charges were pending. It was the kind of story that most people read quickly and moved past. The people who mattered understood what it meant. In Elko, Nevada, on the morning the Review-Journal story ran, a 74-year-old woman sat in the garden behind her house in the thin winter sun and looked at the roses. They were dormant now, cut back for the season their canes bare, and patient. They did not look like much in December. They looked like what they were, something alive and waiting, carrying in their root systems and their cellular memory all the information needed to become something remarkable again when the conditions were right and the season turned and the long winter finally finished its business. Wendell had planted the first of them, the spring after they bought the house 31 years ago. He had consulted 3 books and 1 online forum, and a neighbor who had been growing roses for 40 years, and he had still planted 2 of them at the wrong depth and had to dig them up and start entirely over. He had not been embarrassed about this. He had simply noted it, corrected it, dug them up, and started over. That was Wendell. That was exactly Wendell. Dorothy sat in the garden in the December sun with the pocket watch in her hands. She turned it over once, twice, feeling the weight of it and the warmth it had taken on from her hands. She wound it as she had wound it every morning since Wendell gave it to her. And she held it to her ear for a moment in the old way, the way Wendell had held it, listening not for the accuracy of it, but for the sound of it, the small, precise, mechanical voice of something made to last. It ticked, steadily and slightly wrong, as it always had, as it always would. She looked at the roses. She thought about the spring, which was far away but not unreachable. She thought about what they would look like when the canes leafed out and the buds formed, and the first blooms arrived in that particular shade of deep red that Wendell had chosen specifically that summer 31 years ago, standing in the garden center with a catalog and his reading glasses and the quiet intensity of a man who is choosing something he intends to keep for a long time. She thought about 55 years of mornings, about a kitchen table and the papers, and a man who wept when he found something wrong in the world, because finding something wrong in the world meant that he would have to do something about it. And doing something about it was going to cost him something. And the cost was real, and he knew it. And he wept, and then he started doing something about it. She thought about what it means to be trusted. Not the easy trust that is given freely and costs nothing, but the deep, specific trust of a person who knows you entirely, all your dimensions, your weaknesses as clearly as your strengths, and who places in your hands the thing that matters most, because they know you will not put it down. She thought about a big man in a corner booth who had looked at her with eyes that were not unkind and had made a decision in about 3 seconds that most people would have spent a long time being uncertain about. She thought about 23 motorcycles in the rain. She thought about Patricia Soul's face when the audio file finished playing, and the silence in the conference room after Wendell's voice stopped, and how that silence had felt like something whole rather than something broken. She put the watch back in her pocket. She sat in the garden for a long while with the winter sun on her face, not cold enough to drive her inside, just cool enough to remind her that she was outside and that being outside in December in Nevada in the sun was a specific and unrepeatable thing that deserved some attention. The roses waited. The sun moved in its slow winter arc. The garden was quiet in the particular way that gardens are quiet in December. Not empty, not dormant exactly, but resting. Keeping something in reserve. Storing what it would need for the season that was coming. The season that was always coming regardless of how long the winter seemed. Dorothy Hayward sat in the garden and let the morning be exactly what it was. Somewhere across the country in a conference room in the federal courthouse in Las Vegas, the first pre-trial hearing in the matter of the United States versus Victor Crane was being scheduled for the spring. Somewhere in Washington, in the offices of Nevada's senior senator attorneys, were filing the first of what would be many requests for protective cooperation agreements with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Nevada. Somewhere in Reno, the Nevada State Bureau of Investigation had reopened a file on a car accident that had occurred on Route 278 north of Carlin on a Tuesday morning in October, and the investigator assigned to it had already noted 3 significant discrepancies in the original accident reconstruction that were going to require careful examination. Somewhere on a Nevada highway, a large man on a Harley-Davidson was probably riding north toward whatever came next. The way he always had, the way he would continue to do for as many miles as the road gave him. The watch ticked in Dorothy's pocket. The roses waited. The winter sun moved across the garden the way it had always moved, patient and indifferent and reliable, the same sun that had moved across this garden on every morning of the 31 years she and Wendell had sat in it together, and that would move across it on the mornings ahead, and that asked nothing of the person sitting under it except to be present enough to notice it was there. Dorothy noticed. She sat in the garden, and she noticed the sun and the bare roses and the clean, dry smell of the Nevada winter morning, and the weight of the watch in her pocket, and the particular silence of a thing that has been finished. Not the silence of something absent or incomplete, but the silence of a sentence that has said everything it needed to say and has arrived at last at its period. Whole and complete and done. She closed her eyes for a moment. The sun was warm on her face. The roses were waiting for spring. And somewhere in a courthouse and somewhere on a highway and somewhere in the settled and unshakable truth of what Wendell had built and what she had carried and what they had finished together, the work was holding. It was holding.